Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'm just introducing myself a little bit more. I'll pull up my screen. Okay, so Matt Friedman, I am somebody who's been working on addressing the issue of human trafficking, modern slavery for about 35 years now. I spent the beginning part of my career, 8 years in Nepal, 5 years in Bangladesh, 10 years in Thailand, the rest of the time here in Hong Kong. I'm the CEO of an organization, which I'll talk about a little bit later. I have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to talk pretty quickly. I hope that's okay. I just want to get through a lot of material. So I'm going to do this presentation by first starting off, what is modern slavery, in its holistic sense, what's being done and so forth. Then I'm going to look at how this particular issue became a private sector issue. Why are the private sector companies talking about this? Then I'm going to be looking specifically at manufacturing, and then I'll have some closing statements. But to begin with, when I always start with human trafficking, I start off with cases. And when most people think about human trafficking or modern slavery, they think about the photo in the top left-hand corner for good reason. There are 6.3 million women and girls in forced prostitution around the world. My first exposure to this was 35 years ago. As I said, I was living and working in Nepal. I was a public health officer. My job was to translate resources into healthier people. At that time, we were finding girls 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive. Couldn't understand what was going on. This is a very conservative culture. So we went to go and interview the girls, and we heard pretty much the same story over and over again. And it went something like this. Human trafficker, a guy about 20 years old, would go into a village, say he's looking for a wife. He'd say, I don't want an urban wife, I want a village wife. He'd find a girl 12 years old, befriend her, go to the family and say, I'd like to marry your daughter. They're thinking, wow, he's rich, he's handsome, he's going to marry our daughter, he's going to help us. In this part of the world, it's not uncommon to have that early marriage. They get married, the entire community's there, then he goes to the family and says, I'm going to take your daughter to Kathmandu, the capital where I live, but don't worry, I'll be back in 3 months. But that's not what's going to happen. Instead, he takes her to Mumbai, India, to the red light district where the brothels are. Now, this girl's never been more than 20 kilometers away from her home. When she's in India, she thinks she's still in Nepal. He puts her in a room and he says, honey, stay here. I'll be back in a few minutes. As she was coming in, she saw these people milling around, men, women dressed funny. She says, no, don't leave me. I'm scared. He says, it's okay. I'll be right back. He then goes to the madam to get the $500 for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold from the wedding, and he hands the wedding pictures over to her. He then leaves to go back to Nepal to do this again and again, maybe 40, 50 times in the year. The madam then goes into the room where the girl is and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 20 guys a day because I say so. You can imagine her shock. No, my husband loves me. No, that's what happened. When she internalizes this, many of the girls say, well, I'll kill myself before I do those shameful things. I'm a good Hindu girl. The madam then brings out the photograph of the family and says, is this your mom, your dad, your brother? If you hurt yourself, we'll hurt them. So she's trapped in this situation. In order to make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You shame her. They bring in a number of guys and they use her over and over and over again until eventually she just lays back and accepts whatever happens to her. They broke her will. After that, she'll be with 20 guys a day, every day, for a couple of years until she gets what's called black eye, where she's so depleted physically and emotionally, nobody wants her, so they just throw her out onto the street. The ones that made it to Nepal were the ones that I was interviewing. Many of them never made it back. They had AIDS and they died. So I was hearing this over and over again, but I didn't understand the evil of it until I actually went to those brothels. I was invited by the Indian government to do public health checks. I had a police officer with me. Went into one of the brothels. There was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. This girl saw this Caucasian guy, literally ran up, wrapped herself around me and said, save me, save me. They're doing terrible things to me. I looked down at this child who was hysterically crying. I turned to the police officer and said, we need to get her out of here. He said, we can't do that. So what are you talking about? You're a policeman. He said, if we try to leave, we'll both be killed. To make a long story short, we left. We came back with a lot of police, but of course she was gone. Now I tell this story because I wasn't one of those 15-year-old high school kids that said, when I grow up, I want to become an activist. In fact, I did everything I could not to be. But every once in a while, we are tested. That was my big test. I failed miserably. After that, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and I did what a lot of activists eventually do. Surrender to the fact that now that I've been exposed to this is what I'm going to do with my life. And 35 years later, here I am talking to you. But it's not just women and girls, it's men and boys. Top right-hand photo is a fishing boat in Thailand. Story behind this, a 15-year-old boy from Cambodia is told by his family, you got to go to Thailand and get a job. We're poor, you need to send money back. He goes to Thailand, he's looking around for work, not finding it. Traffickers see this. They go up to him and say, hey, you're from Cambodia, I'm from Cambodia, let me help you out. Let me lend you some money. Okay, well, now that you have my money, you have to stay with me. But guess what? I got this great job. I'm going to take you down to the ocean. I'm going to put you on a boat. The boat's going to go out. You catch some fish. It'll come back. 3 months later, your family's going to be super happy. So he goes down to the ocean, gets on the boat. The boat goes out. He doesn't realize he's been sold onto the boat, but it doesn't come back after 3 months. It stays out for 4 years. This poor kid will end up working 16, 17, 18 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten, he gets tortured, food gets taken away from him. The only food he'll eat the entire time he's there is rice and fish. Nothing nutritious. Imagine what that will do to his body. They often give stimulants to get him to work. If he gets injured, if he gets sick, they don't bring the boat in. They throw him off the side of the boat. At the end of the 4 years, boat comes in. Guy goes to the captain and says, give me something. Captain says, go away. You're illegally in my country. Guy says, I'm going to tell the police what you did. Captain laughs and says, go ahead. We own the police. Another example of human trafficking. I worked for the United Nations for 6 years, and we did a certain number of raids and rescues with law enforcement. The story in the bottom center photo, person from Myanmar, also known as Burma, goes into Thailand because of the violence and the strife and so forth, hears that there's work in a place called Sumit Sakan. They go down to that location. There's about 4,500 seafood packing companies. Knocks on the doors of one of the factories. Factory owner comes out and says, what do you need? Guy says, I'm looking for a job. The factory owner says, okay, I'll give you a job. I will pay you the equivalent of in local money of $50 a month. But if you take this job, you have to stay in the factory and you can't leave. This guy's never made more than $25. He immediately accepts the job, goes into the factory, works under terrible conditions. But at least in the back of his mind, he knows he can send money home. After a couple of months, he goes to the manager and says, I'd like to be paid. The manager says, well, I forgot to mention one thing. For you to work in this factory and live here with room and board, it cost me $54 to support you. I'm only paying you $50. So guess what? You owe me money. You can't leave until you pay that back. So because of this fraudulent scheme, every one of these people, the more they worked, the more debt that was incurred over time. Once a month, they would take one of these people to the back, beat them until they were bloody, take photographs, and then go around saying, if you try to leave, this will happen not only to you, but to your family members as well. These are all kind of extreme cases of what we call modern slavery and human trafficking. Okay, so let's talk about some other forms of human trafficking. I was in Singapore. I presented to a pharmaceutical company. After I did my presentation, they said, well, Mr. Friedman, with all due respect, we're a pretty sophisticated company. We have a very good supply chain. We pay our people well. So I said to them, well, how do you get your product from the warehouse to the pharmacies? They said, we use third-party contractors, transport people. I said, did you ever look to see whether there's any exploitation among them? He said, no. 2 weeks later, they called me and said, looked into it, found a lot of exploitation. Can you come and give us some support? I went to a law firm, again, in Singapore. And I did a presentation and they said, we're a law firm. We don't make anything. We don't do anything that could possibly be related to this. I asked them, who cleaned your building? Don't know. They looked into it, same thing. 2 weeks later, they came back and said they found an issue. The point I'm making is that if you can take advantage of people because of the vulnerability that they have in their particular life, then people do take advantage of it. So human trafficking can be found in all different types of business, including the ones that I just mentioned. Another form of human trafficking that is emerging is human trafficking into scam centers. I don't know if any of you have heard this, but in Southeast Asia, China, over 300,000 young professional people have been tricked and deceived into going to places like Cambodia and Myanmar. They think they have a good job. When they get there, they're put into a scam center and they're forced to scam 14 hours a day. They don't, they get beaten and tortured. Terrible things happen to them. So you have a crime of human trafficking and another crime of scam that have come together. It's like a spotted zebra. It's a new form of human trafficking, but this is a very violent form of human trafficking. It's not something that we even saw 3 or 4 years ago. The point is that human trafficking evolves, it changes over time. This is just another example of that change. Now, I've been using kind of human trafficking and modern slavery there's subtle differences, and let me explain what it was. So, like 35 years ago, when I started doing this work, there was no terminology to describe what I'm focusing. And so the term or the phrase human trafficking came about because most of the initial cases had a person going from one country to another. So the movement of a person from one place to another was considered to be important. So, like drug trafficking, where you take the drugs, move them, sell them, or arms trafficking, this movement was considered to be important. But then over time, people said, well, wait a minute. We have cases where a person goes from one country to another, but we also within a country have cases where a person goes from one district to another district, or within a city from one side of the city to the other. What difference does it make how a person got there? Shouldn't we focus on the fact that the person doesn't get paid, they can't leave, there's violence and threats and so forth? So when they were looking for an alternative phraseology, slavery kept coming up. But because most people think of slavery as something that happened a long time ago, they put the word modern next to it. So human trafficking is kind of the process by which a person ends up in a situation that's called modern slavery. Now, when it comes to the number of people who are in this situation, it's estimated that there are 50 million people in modern slavery. In fact, according to the United Nations, there's more people in modern slavery than any other time in history. There are more people in modern slavery there than there are Canadians or Australians. 50 million people. If I had done this presentation a year ago, the number would have been 40 million. The reason why it went up is they did recalculations because of COVID. So let's say that you were a garment worker in Bangladesh, you were making pretty good money, and then all of a sudden COVID hits. The factory closes not for days or months or days or weeks or months. It closes for years. You don't have any money coming in. So you use your savings, you run out of savings, you start borrowing money, you can't pay that money back. Money lenders come and say, well, if you can't pay it back, I need a family member. They're going to end up in a sweatshop. They're going to end up on a boat. They're going to end up in a brothel. So as a result of that desperation, we see a lot of trafficking increases over time. In Asia, the percentage of people in modern slavery is about 55%. Why? Well, there's a lot of Asians. China, 1.4 billion people. India, 1.4 billion people. Then take Japan and Pakistan and Indonesia. All of those countries have huge populations. In addition to that, the feudal systems that have allowed for this type of exploitation to take place have never been completely dismantled. Go to a modern city, Beijing. Go 20 kilometers outside, you still see exploitation the way it was 200 years ago. So this exploitation is very much part of the fabric of various cultures. The number of people who enter in different time frames, about 9.2 million enter a year. That translates to about 25,200 per day. In the time it takes me to do this presentation, about 700 people or new slave every 4 seconds. So if we count to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, somewhere in the world somebody's entering modern slavery, and the drum beats on and on and on. So the way this kind of works in my situation, about 75% of what I see related to human trafficking is deception, where a person goes to, let's say, a rickshaw wallet and says, how would you like to make 10 US dollars a day? Now, this guy's only made $5 a day, and all of a sudden somebody's after asking him if he wants $10. And this guy says, wow, that's great. What do I need to do? Well, you need to come with me right now. We're going to go to another country. I'm going to get you settled. Everything's going to be great. But you have to make the decision right now. So maybe in the back of his mind, he's thinking, this sounds too good to be true. But what if it isn't? What if it's that one time in my life when I get a break, I can finally get that motorcycle, that tin roof? And so people accept these offers thinking that it's going to significantly improve their life. The second is debt. So let's say that the person needed 1,000 Hong Kong dollars for an operation. Couldn't get it from a bank or anyone else. They go to a money lender, they borrow the money. The operation goes well. And then a couple of days later, they go back to that person and try to give them 1,200 with interest. The person who lent the money says, 1,200? I need 5,000. Person who borrowed the money says, that's not fair. This guy's a criminal. He doesn't have to be fair. They can come up with whatever they want. So fraudulent debt is often what holds people in place. And the debt is not really even calculated. It's just imposed. This is what it is. You have to pay it or something bad's going to happen. That's what holds a lot of people in place. Kidnaps happen, but not very often. And the reason for that is that if a person doesn't want to go from one place to another, they kick and scream. It creates all kinds of possibilities of the police seeing it, people reporting it. So most people, through deception, gleefully go along with the trafficker until they get to the endpoint, because they think something good is going to happen. The age distribution, about a quarter of the cases would be children, the rest are adults. Most people think that modern slavery is predominantly forced prostitution. It only represents about a quarter of the cases. The rest of the cases are forced labor cases, but 60% of the forced labor cases are associated with supply chains, where we get our phones and our clothes and our fish and food and so forth. The importance of this is that as consumers, we buy things, and a percentage of what we buy is tainted by modern slavery. And so we are contributing to the problem. And just like when Al Gore made the convincing argument that we are contributing to the carbon footprint, and that motivated people to want to change their behavior, I would argue that we should do the same thing related to human trafficking. I'll come back to that point a little bit later. So who's supposed to address this issue? Well, it's supposed to be governments. And a lot of governments really don't like this topic. It's embarrassing for certain governments to have slaves, and they don't really know what to do with them, and it's confusing, and they don't want to keep them in the country and so forth. So governments do things, but usually not enough to have a significant impact. I worked for the United Nations for 6 years. I believe in the United Nations system, but I spent a lot of time in five-star hotels eating really good food, debating and discussing the theory of modern slavery. It was too esoteric, it was too abstract. So it was really the NGOs that are doing the lion's share of the work. They do the prevention and the prosecution, go after the bad guys, help the victims, and so forth. But if we go back to the statistics again, if 75% of what we're dealing with is forced labor and 60% of that is associated with supply chains, who else needs to be involved in this? The private sector. But if you think governments don't like this topic, the private sector hates it because they're often on the receiving end of somebody saying you would knowingly use slave labor for shareholder profits. Now, with big companies, branded companies, they will do anything and everything they can to avoid exploitation because it's a huge risk for them. But most consumers don't believe that. And so as a result of that, there's this misconception about the private sector. I'll come back to that point a little bit later as well. Okay, so what I'm going to show you now is the report card for the number of people who were helped out of modern slavery last year out of 50 million, with all of the governments and the NGOs and the United Nations combined. And I'm going to show you out of 500,000 criminals, how many of those criminals were convicted. So think in your mind what a good number would be. And here are the results. Last year, out of 50 million people, 106,000 people, 0.2%. Not even 0.5%, not even 1%. Out of the number of criminals, 500,000, about 6,000, 0.8%. Now, when you look at this, you might ask the question, does the counter-trafficking world not care? Are they lazy? Are they not doing their job? That's not the issue. Anyone who works on this issue, just like people who work on the environmental issue, they desperately want to do something. They desperately want there to be some type of an impact. The issue is this: the profits generated from modern slavery is around $236 billion a year. Second only to drug trafficking, which is about $350 billion. The amount of money available globally to fight this is around $350 million. So you have this much in the way of profits and this much in the way of the response. To put that number into perspective, in the United States, we eat a lot of potato chips, $6 billion US dollars worth. It takes 21 days of potato chip eating in the United States to come up with the equivalent amount of money that's used to fight this. You can see what it is we're up against. Another thing is the scale of the issue. There's about 35,000 do-gooder types like me around the world that work for the United Nations and NGOs and various other organizations against 500,000 greed-incentivized criminals. We have to follow rules and regulations, rule of law. We have to do progress reports, do fundraising, all kinds of other stuff. If anyone goes after their business, they mutate, they evolve, they hurt somebody. Obviously, an unfair advantage in trying to go after these people. And lastly, awareness. Now, I can't see you, so I don't know how many of you would answer this question, but usually if I'm in front of an audience, I ask the audience, how many of you knew 25% of what I was talking about before I said it today? And if there's 100 people, I usually get one or two hands. If you don't know about an issue, you're not going to care. If you don't care, you're not going to do anything. And it's really not your fault. We in the counter-trafficking world haven't done a good enough job to raise awareness and to educate and inform you. And that's why we do these talks. Okay, so that ends the beginning part of my presentation. What is modern slavery, human trafficking? How does it work? What's being done? And so forth. What I'm going to do now is shift over to the private sector, the business world. And I'm going to ask the question, how did the business world all of a sudden find themselves in a situation where they're asked to address this issue of modern slavery? And a lot of it really comes down to that statistic, 0.2%. When governments and regulators came to realize that the response to addressing modern slavery wasn't even hitting 0.5%, and at the same time, they knew there was this nexus between supply chains and the private sector. They said, well, we got to get the private sector involved. But because they felt like the only way to do that was to kind of create a business risk, many of the trends that we see are in that particular direction. So let me go through them pretty quickly. The first one is when it comes to legislation. And the legislation prior to 2012 related to companies and brands didn't really exist. So you'd have businesses and the United Nations and governments periodically coming together to talk about human rights. They talk about human trafficking, modern slavery, forced labor, etc. That often resulted in papers like the UN Principles on Business and Human Rights, conferences, workshops, conventions, discussions. A lot of discourse was taking place, but none of that was binding from a legislative standpoint. It wasn't until 2012 that that changed. The first specific legislation to companies was the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act. Now, what that act basically said is that if you're a big company and you have your products in California and you have profits of $100 million in retail and manufacturing, you got to put on your website what you're doing to fight modern slavery or human trafficking. If you're not doing anything at all, you can say that, but you have to say something. So this was the reason why they had this legislation was to allow consumers to see what companies are doing or not doing. A couple of years later, then you had the UK Modern Slavery Act. It took the ceiling of 100 million US dollars and lowered it to 36 million pounds, sterling pounds, but they added two additional things. The first thing was an annual report. And that annual report's about 20 pages, and it basically covers what a company is doing, not doing. If they find human trafficking, they have to report it, et cetera, et cetera. And that has to also be signed by the board of directors. So what used to be at the compliance level is all of a sudden being reviewed at the highest level of a company. After that, you have the French Act, the Australian Act, the German Act, the Canadian Act. Each of these transparency legislations have added additional bells and whistles. For example, the Australian one has an inventory, so all the submissions from the companies are in a particular location so that people can easily see it. The Australian government does a pretty good job of reviewing them, and if they don't think the company met the expectation, they'll send it back. The German legislation included statements that said you have to have grievance mechanisms for your supply chain partners all the way down to the lowest level. The Canadian Act goes even one step further and says that if you are found to have this, there's fines and penalties. So all of a sudden you have this legislation that says a company has to look at the top of their supply chain all the way to the bottom, and they have to report on all these things. That obviously incentivized companies to understand what they needed to do. Another thing is we're seeing class action lawsuits against certain businesses. So, for example, a retailer from North America wants to buy seafood from Thailand, and then as they're going through that process, they get sued. And the plaintiffs say, well, by buying seafood from Thailand, you're supporting modern slavery. Everyone knows that a percentage of those boats are associated with slavery. You have to use your influence in order to stop that. Now, in reality, most of these companies don't have any influence to do that. And these court cases are not won, but the court cases and the issue spills into social media, regular media, and it creates a naming and shaming reputational risk for these companies. The chocolate industry on a regular basis finds themselves in a situation very similar to this. Everyone knows that the cocoa beans are often picked by people who are being exploited, often children, often forced labor exists with that. Now imagine if your product is chocolate and you want it to be associated with Valentine's Day and Easter and birthdays, and then you have this designation of modern slavery. not very good for your product. So these types of things can create issues and problems for companies, and it incentivizes them to make sure that their supply chains don't have these issues and problems. We see media coverage related to this doubling every year for the past 7 years. So in the 1990s, it was all about HIV/AIDS. And the reason for that is people cared about that at that time. Now, AIDS hasn't gotten any better. It's still bad. But when was the last time you saw an AIDS article or expose? Probably not for a long time, because that development issue switched over to climate change and global warming. And for 15 years, you saw a lot of information about that. The new emerging issue is modern slavery. So we're seeing an increase, a lot of appetite for more information, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing we see is that certain NGOs go after private companies. This particular one, and I'm not going to say what the X company is, a company in Malaysia that was getting palm oil through certain farms and so forth. And the NGO that was actually going after them said, well, you're doing bad things. And so they had a database of 4 million people. They sent an email to each one of them saying, this company is not doing the right thing. Here's their email address. Send them an email saying you're dissatisfied. So imagine if you're a compliance officer, you have a pretty good weekend, all of a sudden you come in on a Monday, you open your email and there's 4 million angry emails in there. Not a good situation for that company, because once again, this will get into social media, this will get into regular media, this creates a reputational risk, and it incentivizes companies to make sure that they don't have this in their supply chain. Lastly, we have ESG. Now, ESG is kind of like the private sector version of the SDGs. E is environment, G is governance, S is social. So prior to COVID, big companies that wanted to measure that they were doing right by the world, would cherry pick the indicators within this category that made them look good for consumers and investors. So if you're an electric car company, you would say we have like 10 environmental indicators and we have 5 governance, but you'd kind of skip these social ones because nobody was paying any attention. Post-COVID, when there was an emphasis on companies doing right by the world, and this sense of, if you're going to do ESG, it should be standardized, so everyone needs to look at all 3 of these. All of a sudden, this electric car company's scores differ, because if you add the social side in, cobalt and lithium come from Africa. It's highly exploitative, and your scores are going to go down. So this incentivizes companies to try to solve those types of issues. And the reason why this matters is millennials and consumers care about this. One study in the United States identified that millennials cared about this to the extent that they were going to make investment decisions based on ESG. In the same cohort, their values will transfer into them being the managers of the retirement funds and the mutual funds and so forth. So this idea that you have to do right by the world, you have to do right by the people who work within your organization, you have to do right by the labor force that's working on this, is an important part of the process. So all of those factors basically kind of contributed to the private sector's need and desire to basically get involved in addressing human trafficking. So let's go even more specific. Let's talk about manufacturing. Let's say that there's a shoemaking company. And so companies that make shoes, let's say somewhere in Asia, they have factories and the sub-factories and so forth. And these factories and sub-factories fall into what is called a supply chain. So tier 1 of a supply chain would be where the running shoe is actually assembled, where they take the various pieces of the shoes and they put it together. Tier 2 is where the rivets and the shoelaces and the sole of the shoe and the textiles come. Tier 3 is the raw material, the wool, the cotton, the metal, anything that is raw material that comes from the environment. So a typical supply chain looks like this. Now, for a long time, major brands around the world have been auditing tier 1. For example, you very seldom find a large company that hasn't been looking at tier 1 factories and auditing them, but they've never been asked to go down to tier 2 or 3. And the reason for that is that the legislation didn't exist, but the legislation now says you have to do that. So imagine if you had 2,000 audits of tier 1, but now you have to include tier 2 and 3. Maybe you have to do 10,000 audits now. Who's going to pay for that? Is the running shoe going to go from 100 US dollars to 150? And so what we're seeing is a consolidation where companies that were competitors when it came to their supply chains are sharing information. Like two apparel companies would say, we're both using the same zipper company. I'll audit the zipper company. You're using, you audit the shoelaces. Somebody else does the rivets. So they're sharing information and they're combining their efforts to avoid the overall cost, but at the same time, giving coverage to all three tiers. Okay, so what are the auditors looking for? They're looking for what's called the indicators of modern slavery. The ILO has 11 of these indicators: abuse of vulnerability, deception, restriction of movement, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see what they are, and it's easy to just Google ILO indicators of modern slavery, and there's some really excellent reports that the ILO puts out related to that. But let me just give a couple of examples of what I'm talking about here to put this into perspective. And so I'm going to use Nepal and Malaysia as an example. I lived in Nepal for years, and so this is a common story that I was exposed to. So let's say that you're in Nepal as a villager, and you make about 50 US dollars a month. Not enough to thrive, but enough to survive. But you want more out of life. Everybody wants more out of life. And so a recruitment agent person goes into that village and goes to this person who's making $50 and says, how would you like to make $250? Villager says, wow, that's great. What do I need to do? Well, you need to come with me to Kathmandu. We need to sign some papers. We need to get you a passport, train you, get you on a plane, send you to Malaysia. Life is going to be good. Oh, by the way, there's one other thing. You have to give me 1,500 US dollars. Villager says, I don't have $1,500. Guy says, don't worry about it. I have a friend who loaned you the money. You can pay it back right away. So he signs one of these loan agreements, doesn't understand the interest rates and the fees and everything else. And so by the time he gets from the village to Kathmandu, it's not 1,500 anymore. It's 3,000. By the time he makes it to Malaysia, it's 4,500. So when he gets to Malaysia, he ends up spending 1 or 2 years just to pay back that, before any money comes in. So he was poor before. He was only making $50, but now no money's going home. And the reason why this is an indicator of modern slavery is because he's stuck in that job until he pays that debt back. That's called debt bondage. And so that holds him in place. Another thing that happens when he is in Kathmandu, he signs a contract in Nepalese. Maybe he can't read, but somebody reads it to him, but he knows what the contract says and he signs it. When he gets to Malaysia, somebody hands him another contract and says, sign this. He looks at it and it's in a language he doesn't know. He says, I can't sign it. You sign it, we're going to send you back and you lose everything. So he signs an agreement not knowing what it says, but it basically cheats him. There's fees, there's targets. If you don't get enough things done, you don't get enough money. And so he's really not making $250. He's making $125. And again, that's being used to pay his debt back. Another thing that happens is when he gets there, they take his passport. They say they need it for a visa, but they don't give it back. And so let's say after 2 years, he says, I've had enough. I just don't want to do this. I'm going to go home. Give me my passport. The management says, no. What do you mean, no? Give me my passport. No, you give it. So basically, he says, I'm going to go to the police. Manager says, go ahead. We'll say we don't have it. They're going to see you don't have any documents. They're going to end up putting you in a remand center, in a jail. They'll send you back. You'll lose everything. So because that document can hold him in place, it's an indicator of modern slavery. You see the living conditions in this other photo here, abysmal, 20 people in a room, 1 bathroom, that type of thing. And those kind of living conditions are difficult. Now, I don't want to pick on both Nepal and Malaysia. We see this all over the world. We see it in North America, South America. I'm just using this example because I know this. But the point is, there are certain risk factors that you see that would come out in an audit related to that. And so what companies are doing is basically changing the way they deal with, their supply chains. One thing they're doing is putting policies, zero tolerance policies that say, we as a company are going to do everything we can to avoid this type of thing taking place. And then in their contracts with their suppliers and sub-suppliers, the factories they work with, that language gets translated down into the supply chain. They're providing a lot of training. And basically what the training does is allows for them to be able to ensure that their people know about this, their leadership knows about this, and their suppliers and sub-suppliers know about this. They want people to know that they have rights because that ensures that those rights aren't being violated. They're doing audits that go deeper into actually identifying what it is that is happening in those locations. They're ensuring that there's no indebtedness among the factories they're working with. They'll go to the factory and say, if there's any indebtedness, we can't work with you. Factory has to pay that back. And lastly, they have hotlines and grievance mechanisms built into things. Because if you don't do that, and you're probably wondering why I have turtles here, I did animal wildlife trafficking prevention for a while, and that was pretty easy. If you found turtles that were going to be sent somewhere, you put them in a box, went to the jungle, let them go, it was easy. But if you're dealing with human beings, you're dealing with some serious issues. You have to do psychosocial, you have to make sure that you give them money, you might make sure they get home, you deal with their issues and so forth. You don't want to be a company that is addressing these types of things. And so it's really important to put these safeguards in place. So the organization that I run is called the Mekong Club. We're based in Hong Kong. We work with the private sector in a positive, supportive, non-naming and shaming way. We use the name Mekong Club because the name doesn't mean anything. Our partners said if you put human rights or human trafficking in the name, it'll scare us away. People will say, why are you going to that company? Do you have a problem? So because we were working in Southeast Asia where the Mekong River was, we called it that, we call it club. We work with banks, manufacturers, retailers, the hospitality sector. Why do we work with banks? Because if any of that $236 billion gets into a legitimate bank, it's money laundering. They get fined. There was a company in Australia that was fined 1.3 billion Australian dollars. Hospitality, they have construction, they have third-party contractors that could be exploited, they have supply chains, seafood that could be exploited, and they have sex trafficking. So all of these businesses want support from an NGO type organization to help them to understand how to avoid these things from happening. One of the things that we do is do an assessment to determine what a company is doing and not doing, and based on that, we help them. We figure out where the gaps are, we give them the tools and the means to do that. One of the things that we do is we have, like, for example, e-learning. Now, our e-learning is based on not a 45-minute video that nobody wants to see. It's too long, it's cumbersome. So instead, we have 15 3-minute videos that address every aspect of this to educate workers, suppliers, C-suite, everybody has this, but it's in multiple languages. 90% of the information related to human trafficking is in English, but 90% of the people who need it don't speak English. So it's essential that we basically have these materials and languages that people understand. Another thing is we develop tools. This particular tool is an app where if an auditor goes onto the factory floor and there's migrants there and he doesn't know where they come from because he doesn't speak the language, he gets the migrant to press the flag from where they come from. And then with headphones on the migrant's head, the migrant listens to a video or an audio that says, we're going to ask you some questions through the audio. And if the answer to the question is yes, press green, no, press red. Are you being exploited? Yes or no, green or red. Do you need help? And so forth. So by using this tool on site without having interpreters, you can figure out if there's a problem. So I just got a couple of more things that I want to say. I've been an activist for a lot of years related to this topic. I come to realize that for us to really make a difference, we really need everybody to be involved in addressing human trafficking. So let me tell you a story. So years ago, back in my Nepal days, I desperately wanted to do something to address the issue of human trafficking. So I decided I was going to write a book. As part of this book project, I went from shelter to shelter to interview the women and the girls. I went to one shelter. There was a girl named Gita. Every time I approached, she said, no, I don't want to my story. But she sat and listened to all the other interviews. When I finished and I was leaving, Gita comes running up and said, I changed my mind. You can have my story. So Gita sat on one side of the table. The rest of us were on the other side of the table. In over a 3-hour period, she told the worst story I'd ever heard of rape and torture and disease, betrayal and murder. It was so off the chart bad, I didn't know what to say. Finally, I turned to Gita and I said, wow, Gita, you must be so angry at the traffickers for the horrible things they did to you. She paused and paused. Then she said, no, I'm angry at you and you and you. She pointed at us. She said, where were you? Said that every day she woke up praying for somebody to help. Nobody came. Said she knew she went to school till she was 12. She knew everything that was out there right in front of the brothel was illegal. Nobody was doing anything. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. She said they're just bad people doing what bad people do, bad things. She said she was angry at the good people, at society for allowing a 15-year-old girl to be commercially raped 7,000 times only to eventually get AIDS and she was dying. Now, I would tell this story because Gita called us all out. She knew that the 35,000 people like me are not going to be enough, that the only way we're going to be able to address this is to get everybody to care about this. And I used to say, and I still say this too, when I get in front of large audiences, if I could get each of you to do one thing related to addressing human trafficking, that's one times 100 or 1,000 or a million, a number of people, if we could get everyone to do some things. So people, they say, well, what is it we can do? Well, one of the things you can do is learn. Guess what? You've done your one thing. How easy was that? You just sat and listened to me. So you've done your one thing. But imagine if you told another person, you've done another thing. You told another person, you told another. If you see articles related to this and you post it on LinkedIn, every time you raise awareness, you've added to the contribution to addressing this. You can be a responsible consumer. By that, what I mean is that you can basically go online to see whether or not the products that you're buying from the brands that you like have a policy related to their website. If they do, congratulate them. If they don't, in a very polite way, say, I like your products. I'd feel better if you had a policy. Companies will respond to that. You can volunteer. I have about 150 volunteers, includes all kinds of professionals. My youngest volunteer was 9 years old. She saw me in a documentary. She contacted me and said, Mr. Friedman, human trafficking is terrible. What can I do to help? I said, you're 9 years old. She said, so what? I said, you're 9 years old. She said, 9-year-olds are the new 16-year-olds. Give me a chance. So I said, what can you do? She said, I can find anything on the internet. So I had some second year Ivy League school law students try to find some things online. They couldn't find it. I gave it to her. 2 days later, I had everything I need. Because that was her God-given gift. We all have gifts. Some it's public speaking or writing or selling t-shirts, whatever it is. You apply that to volunteerism, it really makes a difference. Lastly, you can donate or fundraise and give it off to the companies that need it. All of that adds up. Another thing I just want to end with is that, the NGO world thinks that the private sector doesn't do anything related to this particular topic. But within every big company, they have a compliance section. These are people who very much are like NGO people that are there to ensure that the company doesn't have these types of issues. They get involved in the audits. They go out into the field. They look to see if things are being done. And by doing that, it's kind of heroic because they're protecting the company, but at the same time, they're protecting the people in the supply chain as well. So the private sector has to get kind of some kudos for the fact that many of them have these types of divisions. Not all of them. And we have problems in the private sector. I give you that. But there are also companies that are trying to do the right thing, and they actually do the right thing. These are just a couple of books that we sell in order to raise money to do the work that we do. One addresses volunteerism. The other one is just a textbook on human trafficking. I'm on LinkedIn. I post a lot on this particular topic. If anyone's interested, let me know. With that, I'm going to stop. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, if there's any time left, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.